And always in these Centre for Optimism events, whether it be the Optimist Heart or the Optimist Cafe, the first thing we do is to ask our guests and panelists, what makes you optimistic?
So I don't think there's anything that makes me optimistic. I think it's an inner stance, an inner mindset. And I think things look different when you look from that place.
If we can have an inclusive world and a respectful world, we're going to have a very optimistic world.
And then just put one thought in your mind. You will be an agent of hope and light in the world.
What makes me optimistic at the moment is that I see more and more people understanding that we have a say in how we want to create our world. It's not something passive and we're not victims, that each one of us is responsible, accountable in the very best way, the creative way. So I'm really optimistic as more and more people understand it's up to us.
Hi, it's Victor Perton here, the Centre for Optimism, and our wonderful, wonderful series, The Optimist Heart, brought to us through the genius of Caroline Ward, bringing us a lifetime of wisdom, experience, thinking, connections, facilitation. And our two guests are two people that I reckon I have quoted 40 or 50 times in speeches over the last 2 years. Judy Rodgers, the founder of Images and Voices of Hope. I've visited with her in Upper New York. I've benefited from her wisdom in other environments, both online and in company. Just wonderful. This notion of restorative journalism, of storytelling that brings a sense of hope and optimism is wonderful. And then my friend, Robert Masters, the chair of the Centre for Optimism, many, many years in political journalism, many years in crisis communications, and understanding the yearning of people for a better tomorrow, a better normal, something beyond the pandemic, stories of hope and optimism.
So I'm not going to give a litany of your introduction, Judy, other than to say by disclosure, I know Judy we have shared a similar meditation practice where we've connected over the years in different forums around the world. And Judy, maybe you can give us a little, it's vast, your history. So I'd like to invite you to maybe give us a sort of travel down your trajectory in relation to this idea of the impact of storytelling on our humanity and our future. Can I ask you to do that?
Mm-hmm. You can.
Great.
Yeah, you know, the older you get, the longer those introductions get. So I'm glad you didn't attempt that. So, you know, I worked in media for a lot of years, actually reluctantly. It wasn't my choice. It was a series of accidents. And I worked for big media companies, CBS and 20th Century Fox and New World Entertainment. And at a certain point, I was noticing that all the meetings I was in, they were mostly about counting things. So we counted Nielsen ratings and box office receipts and magazine subscriptions and, you know, all kinds of things. But no one was really asking what was happening to the people who were experiencing this media. And at this point, the US was exporting a ton of media. I really think it was our largest export. I think it was bigger than defense. You know, news shows and soap operas and movies, and nobody seemed to be asking about what happened to the people sitting in their living rooms, wherever they were around the world, absorbing this stuff. So with some other people in 1999, we pulled together what we thought was one conversation in Manhattan with people in media. And we had it was lots of different kinds of media. I don't know if you remember the artist Peter Max from the 60s. He was in the room, and, you know, the publisher of Warner Books and various news people, etc. And we only had one question, which is, what is the impact of public image making and public storytelling on society? Now, this was June of 1999. The news people thought it was a stupid question. It was like, doesn't matter. You know, we're going to tell the truth, and whatever happens, happens. The artists, you know, they were different, etc. Everyone engaged in a different way. And it actually got a little bit rowdy. At the end, when I was supposed to be inviting them to quiet down, they weren't quieting down. The mics were full. Everyone was really worked up. So we had hit a nerve. And so the next, I don't know how long, we just started holding these conversations in a lot of places. And clearly, this was something on everybody's mind, what was going on with media. Now, as you know, and Rob, you know this for sure, media was basically, news media were particularly event-driven. So when something happened that was an anomaly, bomb blows up in a market, that's the story. Bomb blows up in a market, 20 people dead. Next, you know, and so, you know, that model has pretty tough in terms of impact on people who are watching, because it's just a series of events. And so we were proposing that there had to be another way to think about this. And we really went into kind of what was people's aspiration. Why did you go into this? Why did you decide to be an anchor? And what did you want? Name and fame or glory, or were you hoping for something else? But then things shifted. In December of 2012, a mentally disturbed young man walked into a school in Newtown, Connecticut, which is fairly near where I live, and he shot 24 7-year-olds. And I don't think there's anything sadder than this. And when that happened, all the news trucks descended on this little town. ABC, CNN, they're all, you know, the town, you know, the news trucks are there, and the mics, they're sticking mics in front of these grieving people. And the editor of the town paper was a guy named Curtis Clark. And Curtis couldn't even get his people around the news trucks to get to this elementary school. And when I was talking with him later, he was saying, you know, I felt the job of the paper was to create a redemptive narrative. He said, we didn't want to be the saddest place in the world for the rest of time. And so when I heard that, I called a board member. I said, what do you think? Redemptive narrative? I mean, isn't there something we can do with that? And the board member said, how about restorative narrative? So we started then in 2013. We gathered together trauma psychologists and oral historians and newspaper writers and social media people and metrics people, and we just came together over and over and over again. Then we got some support from a foundation called the Fetzer Institute, and we began fellows programs trying to figure out how to work with this genre that we were calling restorative narrative. We did not claim to have made up the genre. People have been writing them for years, just instinctively, but we named it and we began to work it. And I'm just gonna say, in essence, I think it's about, I think it's for all media, not just news. And I think it has to do with the stance that you take. And in essence, what you're doing is you're following a narrative arc, not of the anomaly, not of the bomb blowing up in the market and the terrorist who did it and the dead people, etc. You're following the narrative arc of recovery and restoration. Because according to the positive psychology people, 80% of people are fundamentally resilient. They will come back. It may take them a while, and they won't come back quite the same. I mean, they'll have their memories and their traumas that they're bringing with them, but they are resilient. They will recover. And in an era in which trauma has become chronic, we can't use the old model. We have to be able to work with the restorative phenomenon in humanity.
I've got many questions. And one would be in relation to the level of receptivity and the courage that it's taken, because I've had conversations with some of the journalists and the media makers that have stepped into and up to the cause, if you like, and it requires courage, because as you said, the news editors go, this is stupid, what are you talking about, just go out there and get the story. So what you've done, I guess, in you and the rest of the board and the team in Images and Voices of Hope, is to create a community of courageous storytellers and image makers who support each other and going forward. So can you talk a little bit about maybe some of the examples of people, because I know there's some amazing examples.
Well, there's lots of stories. And in terms of receptivity, you know, the issue is really that it's usually a longer story arc. And Rob would, you know, he's a practitioner, I'm not. The kind of media I did was different. But, you know, when you're asking an editor to stay with a story, you know, let me go back and see how they're doing in New Orleans after Katrina, you know, annihilated the town. Let me go back and see what's happened here and how the people are doing. So you need the support of editors who are going to stay with you. Actually, there's pretty good evidence that people like restorative narratives. A lot of that evidence comes from social media, which is not a long story arc usually, but that people like to understand. You see, the essence of restorative narrative is really from positive psychology. And the positive psychologists who've been around now for about 25 years basically say something pretty simple. They spend a lot of time defending it and showing how it works. But the essence of what they say is that when we're in positive emotional states, joy, contentment, awe, gratitude, empathy, kindness, mercy, etc., we actually have more capacity. We generate more ideas, we act on more ideas, we're more creative, we're more pro-social. So our ability to recover is stronger when we're in positive emotional states. People in negative emotional states, I mean, if anyone who's with us this morning has ever had a bad day or been depressed, probably not. Maybe you know someone who's been depressed. You don't want to go outside. You don't want to talk to anybody. You know, you certainly don't have the energy to put anything together. So that's the kind of the inner dynamic. In the spiritual world, we call it virtue, right? Those same things that you call positive emotions if you're a psychologist, you call virtue if you're a theologist. It's the same thing. It's innate to the human being, and it has a lot of capacity. Some of the stories are really lovely. I'll just talk about a couple. So one of them actually wasn't news. It was an ad agency, and it was in Colombia, and it was a few years ago when the Colombians were trying to get the FARC to come out of the jungle. They wanted them to give up their weapons and come and be a part of society. And so the Minister of Defense got a hold of a creative agency in Bogota and said, help us do this. So the creative agency, the first idea they came up with was they designed these big plastic bubbles that could pull apart, kind of like a children's Easter egg, you know, those plastic eggs. And in them, they put messages, come home for Christmas, we miss you, etc., and put them back together, and they floated them down the Amazon, knowing that the FARC members were living down the Amazon and they would find these plastic bubbles. And then the next year, they went to a lot of mothers whose kids had gone off to join the FARC when they were young. And they had them bring baby pictures and children's pictures, and they blew them up to the size of billboards, and they stuck them on the front of buildings in this town square, and basically saying the same thing. we miss you, come home. And they did this in a town that they knew the FARC were living near. So this is when an ad agency, instead of trying to pitch, right? When the ad agency shows up and says, you know, let's put all of our creative, you know, power and imagination to work on something like this. Another story I'm thinking of that is a journalist story, and it's going on now actually, is one of the fellows in our restorative narrative program came up with an idea that she would take the city of Chicago, which has had a lot of violence. And most of the people in south side of Chicago are poor, and many of them are African American. And on the north side of Chicago, most of them are white, and they're more affluent. So she took a map and she folded it, and she lined up the people who were at 59th Street North and 59th Street South. And she began to write the stories about these different people and eventually brought them together. It's called the MAP Project. So her point was, you know, yeah, we can talk about all the inequities and all the shootings in South Side of Chicago and all of that, or we can begin to see if we can't get some interplay here between these people who are on the same street, basically, but they're at the other end of the street. And can we bring them together in community? So there's lots of very interesting, you know, there are projects people did on immigration. There was one project that a young woman did with the mother of a young Black man who was shot, and her recovery, you know, what she did with her sorrow. We had the oral historian of the 9/11 Museum come and talk about what they did so that the 9/11 Museum wasn't just an impossible place to go, so that there were, you know, at the end of it, as you make your way through the museum, as you get to the end, you see what the families and the fire departments have done to try to, you know, build in this sense of hope and resilience. Let me stop there.
Thanks, Judy. And I'm remembering a story which I saw. It was a TED Talk actually with Jane McGonigal. And I know she's also a member of Images and Voices of Hope. And she's a gamer. And she had an accident. I think she fell or something, and had concussion, and a very rare thing of becoming chronically, clinically, terribly depressed as a result of this concussion. And she couldn't get herself out of bed, exactly as you were describing, and had nothing to give. She couldn't work, nothing. It was 3 months, I think. But she started to use her gaming techniques of creating an avatar for herself and having little rewards and, you know, finding treasures and arms. And, you know, she kind of added this thing and created a game for herself that reshaped her neurology, reshaped her energy, as you're saying, you know, the energy, the positive capacities, until she came out, which then became a game that has served people on many, many levels, not just with depression, but people who've been hopeless about so many things, to step by step out of it. So it's a really interesting field. Now, I normally I won't just have the conversation, but I'm going to invite you, Rob, to jump in here and either share or explore something with Judy that's sort of triggering anything in you, or however you want to participate in this moment, because you come from a long history of political journalism, like being in the White House, Judy, but in the press gallery in Canberra, and then moving on into organizational corporate communications and leadership communications and things. So I'm thinking you've probably got something you might like to add in or question or be curious about, whatever.
Thanks, Caroline. I look, it's very fascinating today, and as you rightly say, I come from a long history in journalism, and there are two things that are really worrying me today about journalism, and that's why I think what Judy is doing is so important from the community, but also for journalism itself on the daily news base. The first thing is that at a tertiary level, there is discussion going on here in Australia about two forms of journalism. One is cause-related journalism, and the other is issues-related journalism. Cause-related is particularly taking up a particular cause, and the biggest one at the moment, naturally, is COVID. But cause in more recent times has been the climate change debate. And so papers and journalists have skewed their reporting to support a particular cause. In issues-related journalism, the journalists have actually deliberately gone out to create an issue in the way they question people or the way they write about a particular thing. Now, I find that quite disturbing on both counts, because I come from the school that you had to report, you had to balance, and you had to give both sides of the story in everything you did. You could not write one side, you know, one day and the other side the next, or one side 1 hour and the next hour the next, and then try and bring them together at the end of the day. So that is divisive right throughout the communities. And I was reflecting when we're having our earlier discussions, and I think Judy might be aware of it. There's an American surveys that are going on in the media today, and it started in 2018 with Gallup and the Knight Foundation. And there was pessimism about journalism and the reporting of news. And the 2020 survey showed that there was a deepening pessimism and further partisan entrenchment in the way they reported, and that whilst they believed it was important for the democratic process, they had great skepticism about factual and trustworthy information. So we're in my old days, when I first started, we always looked at a story which said, if it bleeds, it leads. And that, I think, is starting to become true again in much of their reporting. But then when you have major issues like we have with the pandemic here in Australia, where we have the bushfires, and then we have the floods, and then we have the drought, many newspapers and many reporters are now starting to look at that, as Judy said, that important side of actually the positive news stories to actually engage communities and to change people in their thoughts and processes. And it's the good news stories out of adversity that are starting to bring people together. And I'll go later, Caroline, in addressing the question you originally posed about what generates hope, optimism and energy towards a true feeling of possibility for everyone. But it's those types of stories from leaders now that I'm finding resonates more and more with people.
Well, I would ask Rob to go with that question now. So I was just thinking I wanted to ask, so in these very complex times, it's not a simple, I don't think, as, you know, painting good news Pollyanna stories, because people can, you know, feel if there's something that's real, and it is complex, right? But so in this complexity, what would be the story you would tell about 2020 that is real, but brings a sense of hope and optimism and a real energy of possibility for us? So what would be your story, Rob? And then I would like Judy to answer that too.
Right, well, well, there are the three words that you put forward, which I found quite interesting, which was hope, optimism and energy. And because of my association with Victor and the Centre, we use the word optimism, and we always use the word and with it. We do not use the word but. And so the but part of a conversation is never there anymore. With hope, hope is all about having a plan, and energy is all about having a purpose. So you've got to look at those three elements with that as background. Now that doesn't quite frame my answer to your story, but I'd like to give you two other things that I thought resonated in line with your original question. And one is about leadership and building a community in a crisis, and especially this pandemic. And it also relates back into what Judy was just saying, that the Queen of England, for those in America, the Queen actually was very astute in her message to all the Britons at the start of the pandemic. And she called for discipline, resolve, and fellowship. And the sentence that she used, which I thought was quite profound, was, "The pride in who we are is not a part of our past. It defines our present and our future." And then in America, Judy, a chief surgeon at a New York hospital sent an all-staff memo reminding all the staff at the hospital that patients survive because we don't give up. And then America took that up, the UK took that up with another simple message that said, stay home, protect the NHS, which is the National Health Service, saves lives. So stay home saves lives. So there's an underlying optimistic approach to them and a positivity about it as well. Now here in Victoria, we've used a phrase called "stay apart keeps us together." I don't know whether that resonates as much as the other two or the three, but when Victor always asks us, he says, you know, what makes you optimistic? Well, I think in this crisis, we can add a little bit more to it from a personal point of view. And I think this is where journalism comes into in their whole writing and the background to what they can actually do. And that what have been the unexpected positive outcomes from the crisis for you? And secondly, what changes have you made that you would like to keep once the crisis has ended? Now, in all of that, many of you have read the Aesop fables of, 700 or something famous stories, etc. And we all know that it's all based around the issues of cruelty and unfairness and negativity, but they all are overcome by wit and kindness and moral bravery. So that's the basis of them. And I've lived for what was, I think they were started about 700 years before Christ. So they've lived through decades, centuries of time, etc. So my crisis message, and I think it can relate to journalists as well, is that the crisis will define you by taking pride in who you are today and what you do in connecting to a deeper sense of purpose and giving meaning to your life and to others. So that's what I would hope that the basis for a lot of journalism is about today, to give purpose and meaning to people's lives in the way they actually go about writing. And as Victor and I always say, optimism doesn't have to be used as a word in framing policy or various strategies or anything like that. It can be incorporated into the thinking. And this is where we think it's so important, and to change all that dialogue from a negativity or a pessimistic base. So we're always going to have negative approaches in media. That's part and parcel of it. But there can be a lot more optimism in the way it's reported and the way stories are told. And that's what Judy is doing. She's changing the whole dynamics of the way, or balancing the dynamics of the way news and that should be presented today.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you very much, Rob. And I love that this is a time where we reflect and get greater meaning and a sense of purpose during this crisis. So I'm going to ask you, Judy, if you would give me what would be your story about 2020 that's realistic and gives a sense of hope, optimism, and the energy of real possibility for humanity, for us.
Right. Well, first, I just want to compliment Robin. His great questions,
Yeah.
because actually it's the questions that frame the narrative that gets told. So if you say, how are you enduring this pandemic? You get one answer. And if you say, you said some version of what benefits or silver linings are you finding and what do you want to keep from what we did, you get a completely different narrative. So I think he just demonstrated exactly what the workings of it are. I think when we look at the tough stories in 2020 and 2019, and one thing that I'm struck with are we have some young heroes that are really motivating people. Malala set the world on fire. I mean, that girl, the fact her father made sure she was able to do what she did, but she was the voice of the need for women to be educated, the dignity of the girl. I thought that was one of the best stories we had in whatever year that was, not that long ago. And then there's Greta Thunberg, who, by the way, is on the autism spectrum, and who, when the climate change thing came to New York, people only wanted to talk to Greta Thunberg. They didn't want to talk to scientists and all of that. They just said, give us Greta, put her on a stage, let her talk to us. So I think the voice of youth is actually really important right now. I know those of us who've been around the block, we've got lots of stories to share, and we know some things, and we're happy to share those things. But I honestly think we ought to step back. And I think we ought to, Carola Fuentes in Chile, Carolyn, I mean, I see a lot of real wisdom and courage and resolve and acceptance. I think in a climate like ours, you can spend a lot of time in disappointment. Gosh, this wasn't how I thought it was going to go. Gosh, this is bigger than I thought. Boy, it could be kind of hard, or you can just show up with, this is where we are, and this is our best opportunity now to do this, and put everyone's focus and attention on that. And I feel there's two young women, that's exactly what they've done. And I think the media can have a lot of traction when it finds the right spokesperson for those messages. When with Images and Voices of Hope, I don't know what year it was. I think it was, what year did apartheid end? 2000?
Mandela became president in 1994.
94. Okay. So in 2002, we brought Desmond Tutu to Toronto. And all he wanted to do was thank the media. He said, when we needed support for the embargo in order to end apartheid, it was the Canadian media that stepped forward. And so we had the publishers there were like 6 of them, and he just said, thank you. Thank you for showing up when you did. Thank you for doing what you did. So I think in any time, whether it was that time in apartheid, or it was, our never-ending story around climate change, or it's, the story of women, the Me Too movement and all of its branches, or in the US, of course, we are having a big Black Lives Matter moment. We have an original sin that we are going to have to come back to face. And we've had, when John Lewis, who probably you all wouldn't know, but he was a congressman from the South, when he laid in state, people lined up for days to come and pay respects. His father had been a sharecropper, his grandfather had been a slave, and he spent his whole life working on human rights, and he never moved to the place of hate. He always stayed in the space of love and nonviolence, as did Martin Luther King. So I think it depends. Media has the opportunity to decide what story they're going to highlight. And I think those choices, which are usually made by editors, not the creatives so much. The creatives go out there and write the stories, the writers, but it's the editors who get to decide, which story gets attention. And I think we've got some good people to pay attention to. With Images and Voices of Hope, we always emphasized that there are two things: restorative narrative and reflective practice. The idea being that you really can't change your view of the world or your work in the world if you don't have the practice of going inside and kind of stabilizing in the space you want to work from. You know, if your insides are a space of anger, you'll work from anger. You know, if your insides are a space of worry and restlessness, your outside will be, you know, that's what you'll write from. That's what you'll create from. You know, you can't create these powerful stories of peace if inside you're really a wreck. And so the ability to do, I think Rob mentioned the Gallup people, or you did. You know, the Gallup organization actually are the people who drive the strengths-based movement to a large extent. And well, they're one of the players in the strengths-based movement. And so the idea is to understand that all of this is an inside-out proposition. People show up as worth our trust because they're trustworthy inside. And so I think it's all about our own practices. I can't imagine anyone managing in the world today without having some kind of a reflective practice. Everyone may be different, whatever practice speaks to you, but the ability to ground yourself, to know yourself as kind of the inner being, the self, the spiritual being, to understand your own kind of best ground, to understand sort of who you are at your best and what virtue is, and then to work from that place. I think that's where these stories come from. And it's not only the stories, it's where your ability to see them comes from. Mm-hmm. You know, you can have something going on right in front of you, but if you are a convinced cynic, you won't see it. You know, you'll find Malala preposterous. You'll find Greta ridiculous, right? I mean, you won't see that living in what's going on with them is the power of sort of their conviction, their truth, their tireless energy, and the mix of innocence and wisdom. So you have to have a certain stance to even be able to see that.
So Judy, thank you. In this little Sunday morning program over here, we stop for a few minutes at some point to have some kind of reflection. And as I know you are a long-term meditator, would you like to just take us in it's just 3 or 4 minutes, a kind of reflective journey? Maybe it's about innocence and wisdom, I don't know, whatever you're inspired to do. Would you do that for us?
It looks like there's 57 of us here having our kind of collective moment of optimism. Thank you, Victor, for being the seed of that. So I think the key is to be able to quiet the mind. And since you all are in the morning, you haven't had too much to distract you yet. So you can start with whatever freshness is in your morning. And just notice sort of what's around you. What thoughts, what memories, all of that's around you. And then bring it down, let it land so that you're sitting in stillness. And then notice what's going on inside you. Start with the body. Make sure there's no discomfort or anything like that. If there is, just notice it, let it go. And all the while, keep your back straight so your spine is cooperating with you. And then you take the focus of your attention and bring it inside and let it rest really quietly behind the eyes. Because this is the seat of the soul. So this is the seat of innocence. It's the seat goodness. It's the seat of peace. It's the seat of love. And the seat of hope. And you know, when we lose hope, we often feel breathless. And when we lose courage, it's like our heart shrinks. So when you bring courage into you, when you bring hope into you, you bring it into your breath and you bring it into your heart. So allow your heart to fill with love and courage. And certainty that everything is going to be okay. And then allow your breath to fill with hope. And just as you take 2 or 3 breaths, allow yourself to fill with the lightness of hope. And then just put one thought in your mind. That you will be an agent of hope and light in the world.
So we're going to close this formal part right now. It's been very rich and insightful, and thank you both, Judy and Rob, because obviously you have extraordinary experience in these fields. But more than that, I would say I feel very, I want to use the word blessed. I feel very blessed that you've both been with us, because you have these kind of auras, these fields of energy which are very encouraging, as though everything will be okay. There's a sort of certainty about you both, and nuances within that. But
Brilliant. Thank you, guys. The 3 of you inspire me.